Good morning, everyone. I hope you are staying warm on this chilly Monday. Wanted to kick off with just a few general announcements. First off, there has been reports of possible chilly weather coming through tonight. So, stay inside, stay warm, stay safe. And then second announcement is that I've had a few emails regarding late work. So you do not have to email me when you turn in late work. You can just turn it in. I will grade it. I know it's been a crazy couple of years, 2020, 2021. So I, at this point, am not taking points off for late work. This does not mean don't do your work. Please stay up on top of it so you don't feel overwhelmed. But if there's a day where you're like, hey, I need to take care of, my mental health, or I'm just not feeling very well today, take that day off. You can complete the work later. I'm not going to take off points. Okay, perfect. Now that we have that out of the way, we'll jump into what we're doing this week. So this week, we are going to be looking at a lot about this president and his policies in the U.S. and some of the impact on particular groups throughout the United States. So take a moment, look at this. Does anyone know what president is pictured here? And what bill it is? So pause the video if you need, take a minute to think, go through your wallet. So if you had a chance to think about it, hopefully you realize this is the $20 bill, and this is President Andrew Jackson. The $20 bill itself is actually currently a part of quite a bit of controversy, because people are talking about, hey, maybe we'll remove Andrew Jackson for reasons that we'll get into a little bit later this week. So Andrew Jackson, particularly the age of Andrew Jackson, as we call it, often in U.S. history. A few things to know. Andrew Jackson was nicknamed Old Hickory for his toughness. He was a military general and had a lot of history, and that, in particular, he was a big, important person in the War of 1812. He wins some major victories, including the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, but the biggest one is the Battle of New Orleans. This battle launches him into the public sphere, that not only did he beat the British, but he beat them in New Orleans, which is an important city at the time. And we often forget that technically the War of 1812 was already over when the Battle of New Orleans happened. No one just told Andrew Jackson. The other aspect of Andrew Jackson to keep in mind that we'll come to a lot in the next week is that he was also in charge of leading campaigns for Native American and indigenous removals from their lands. Particularly, he was famous for his battles and wars and hunting the Seminole and the Creek Indians in Florida and Georgia. This kind of starts to hint at why he might be a controversial person. So, election 1824. It's John Quincy Adams versus Andrew Jackson. And John Quincy Adams, he is son of President John Adams, has a good pedigree, strong support in New England, and favors a lot of internal improvements, such as roads, bridges, canals, things to help big industry. Jackson is much more of a everyday person's kind of president. So the election of 1824, what ends up happening is that no one wins the majority, 50% or more. The Federalist Party is dissolved. There is no more Federalist Party anymore. Democratic Republicans run, but no one receives the majority. We can see right here, 43%, 31, 13, and 13. And same. So when this happens, we know that the House of Representatives is the one that will actually vote in the next president. And they actually vote in Adams, despite him having less popular and electoral votes than Jackson. So keep that in mind. The House of Representatives voted in the person who did not win the popular vote or the electoral vote. This causes problems. This cements Adams as, seeming corrupt. Like maybe he bribed or, used some information against the House of Representatives to get them in. On the other hand, Jackson is seen as a man of the people. He had been elected in by the people, but didn't get, the presidency. So while Jackson isn't president, he actually starts working and supporting removing property qualifications for voting. So he starts to dismantle the need for property to vote. So it used to be you had to be white, male, and own land. So now he's like, any white male should be able to vote. So now, 4 years later, the election of 1828, it is once again Andrew Jackson versus John Quincy Adams, and this time, Andrew Jackson wins quite a lot. As president, he becomes the 7th president. He strengthens the power of the presidency, so he gives more and more power to the president. And he takes on many different opponents. So people, everyday white men may like him, but there are people who are going to be against him as well. So in particular, African Americans and enslaved populations, bureaucracy, and Native Americans. There's a lot of people who are not such fans of Jackson. So his fight versus bureaucracy. Overall, he distrusts D.C. bureaucrats, so people who worked in D.C. So what he does is he fires them all. And instead, he replaces them with his supporters, with his people. And if you helped support his campaign or donated money, you got a job in government. And this is called the spoils system. So you're technically not allowed to do this anymore, but it still happens, where, let's say you gave money to his campaign, he would maybe put you in charge of the Department of Agriculture or Education. This is where that kind of started. So he fired all the people and replaced them with people he liked and that only supported him. Andrew Jackson versus Native Americans. Given his past with Indian removal and the Seminole and the Creek, he also passes, as soon as he becomes the president, the Indian Removal Act, which we're going to be looking at a lot this week. And this forces, quote-unquote, the 5 civilized tribes forced west onto reservations. And we'll, once again, be looking at this a lot more this week. And what this becomes known as is the Trail of Tears in history, because it was a forced march. It was a theft of land, and it led to a lot of suffering and death. So this is why Andrew Jackson is a very controversial president. We'll look a little bit more into that and the point of views and perspectives of people who were actually there. So Andrew Jackson versus the National Bank. He thinks the bank, particularly the National Bank, is the tool of the wealthy. So he vetoes it. He says, we're not going to have it. And he places federal money in state banks instead. This causes problems. Oops, looks like my thing cut off. But this causes panic because if the federal government doesn't have control of the money, then, each individual state has that power, and it makes it unstable across the nation. And lastly, versus nullification, South Carolina does not like the federal tariff, so Andrew Jackson starts to tax imports or goods that are coming into the country. And South Carolina claims it doesn't have to follow this. And it can nullify the tariff or make it void. Jackson threatens to send the military to collect or force the tariff. So if the South Carolina will not collect the tariff, the tax, then Jackson will make the military collect the tax. And so his legacy essentially is the creation of the modern Democratic Party. So Jackson splits the Democratic Party, and his thinking of that is that, more people should be able to vote. There should be more votes, more participation in the government. He didn't protect and try to spread out popular democracy, once again, by making land ownership not necessary for voting. Now all he had to be was white and a male. So more people could vote. And he expanded the use of the presidential veto. So he vetoed more than any other president in the past, which means he rejected a lot of laws and bills that he didn't like. So our exit ticket, and looking at what we'll be looking at later in the week. So, Indian Removal Act, right, is passed. Which tribes are being removed? So, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Creeks, the Cherokee, the Seminole, Foxes, Sacs. We're also going to have Ojibwa here, some Anishinaabe out of Michigan, in Ohio and Indiana. These are tribes that had previously had treaties with the U.S. We had already agreed as a country that this was their land and they got to keep it. Andrew Jackson comes in and says, you know what, no, white settlers want it, and so we're going to take it. And so we'll talk a little bit more about all this, but they are eventually moved off their land and moved into the state, modern-day state of Oklahoma. So this week and later this week, we're actually going to be researching the different indigenous groups, the impact of these policies, and kind of how their lives were before and after.